The year is 2026, and somewhere between your grocery receipt and your car payment, the largest tax increase in a generation just happened. But here is the thing. Nobody called it a tax, they called it a tariff, and they told you someone else was paying it. But let's get one thing straight before the political spin machine buries this in noise. This isn't a story about trade policy. This isn't a debate about free markets versus protectionism. This is a forensic audit of the single largest transfer of wealth from American consumers to the federal government since 1993. And the receipt has your name on it. Imagine you wake up one morning and everything in your house costs more. Your coffee, your car, your kids' clothes, your refrigerator, your medicine. Not because there is a shortage, not because of a natural disaster, not because of a pandemic or a war or a drought, but because one man sitting in the Oval Office signed a piece of paper and declared your shopping cart a national emergency. How do you raise taxes on 330 million people without a single vote in Congress? How do you add $2.1 trillion to the national tax bill and convince half the country that foreigners are footing it? How do you promise a manufacturing renaissance and deliver a grocery bill instead? Today, we're opening the books. This is the forensic audit of the most ambitious, most chaotic, and most expensive trade experiment in modern American history. This is the $2 trillion tax Americans don't know they're paying, the tariff trap. Or, how to promise a manufacturing renaissance and deliver a grocery bill instead. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the promise. The original pitch, because every con needs a good opening line, and this one was a beauty. The year is 2024. The campaign trail. Donald Trump stands at rally after rally and delivers a message so simple, so emotionally satisfying, that it bypasses every economic textbook ever written and lands directly in the gut. Other countries have been ripping us off for decades. I am going to put tariffs on them, they'll pay. You won't. And the factories will come roaring back. The crowd roars. The hats wave, the chant builds. And nobody in that arena stops to ask the follow-up question. Wait, if other countries pay the tariff, why would that make them want to build factories here? And if the tariff raises prices on imports, doesn't that mean we're paying more? And if we're paying more, isn't that a tax? It sounds great. It sounds like justice. It sounds like someone is finally going to make China and Mexico and Europe pick up the tab for decades of trade imbalances. There is just one small problem. It is not how tariffs work. It has never been how tariffs work. And if you skipped Econ 101, here's the explain it like I am 5 version. A tariff is a tax, full stop. It is a tax paid at the border by the American company importing the goods. Not by China, not by Vietnam, not by Germany. By the American importer. That importer then has 3 choices. Eat the cost and lose money. Pass it to the consumer and raise prices. Or stop importing and hope someone in Ohio can make the same thing for less. Spoiler alert. Option 2 wins almost every time in option 3. It takes years, sometimes decades, to build domestic manufacturing capacity for products that entire industries abroad are optimized to produce. You don't just flip a switch and start making semiconductors in Nebraska. But here is the part that makes it even worse. When you tariff raw materials like steel and aluminum, you are not just raising the price of imported steel. You are raising the price of everything made with steel, cars, washing machines, bridges, buildings, can openers. The tariff cascades through the entire manufacturing chain like a virus. Every product that touches a tariffed input gets more expensive. And in a modern economy where supply chains are global and interconnected, that means everything. But the campaign promise was too good to fact-check in real time. And on January 20th, 2025, the experiment began. Here is the first nail in the coffin, the Liberation Day shock. April 2nd, 2025. The president called it Liberation Day. The markets called it something else entirely. In a Rose Garden ceremony, Trump announced the most sweeping tariff package since the Great Depression. A 10% baseline tariff on virtually all imports from every country on Earth. But that was just the appetizer. China got hit with a cumulative rate that eventually climbed to 145%. The European Union faced 20%. Vietnam, 46%. Thailand 36%, India 26%. Even tiny, uninhabited islands in the Pacific got tariffed. The formula used to calculate these rates was, to put it diplomatically, creative critics called it napkin math. The administration claimed it was reciprocal. Economists looked at the spreadsheet and couldn't reverse engineer the logic. Let's look at what happened next because the numbers are genuinely hard to comprehend. On April 3rd, the day after the announcement, the S&P 500 dropped 4.84%. The Nasdaq fell 5.97%, losing over 1,050 points, the largest single-day point loss in its history. The Dow shed 1,679 points. The Russell 2000 dropped 6.59% and entered a bear market. In 2 trading days, roughly $5 trillion in market value evaporated. 5 trillion, that is not a rounding error. That is the entire GDP of Japan disappearing from retirement accounts, pension funds, and college savings in 48 hours. Imagine you are a 62-year-old teacher in Michigan. You've been saving for retirement for 30 years. You check your 401k on Thursday morning, and it is down $18,000. Not because of a pandemic, not because of a war, because of a press conference in a garden. Now imagine you are a small business owner who imports components from Vietnam. On Monday, your cost basis was 10%. On Wednesday, it was 46%. You have contracts to fulfill at the old price. You have payroll due on Friday. Your margins just went from slim to negative overnight. And the government's advice is essentially build a factory in Kansas. With what money? Trump paused the country-specific tariffs on April 9th after the market carnage. The phrase "Trump always chickens out" briefly trended online. But the 10% universal tariff stayed. The China tariff stayed. The steel and aluminum tariffs stayed. And the message to every boardroom in America was crystal clear. Nobody knows what is coming next. The policy could change on a tweet. The tariff rate you plan around today might double tomorrow, and that uncertainty became the real tax, an invisible surcharge on every business decision in America. This is nail number 2, the price tag you didn't vote for. Here's where the forensic audit gets personal. Because the tariffs didn't stay in Washington, they crawled into every aisle of every store in America. Let me walk you through your new shopping list. The average price of a new car in the United States was already $49,500 in the first quarter of 2025, already a stretch for most families. The tariffs added an estimated $3,300 to $5,200 to that sticker price. Even domestic cars. Why? Because modern American cars contain about 16,000 parts, and a huge percentage of those parts are manufactured abroad. The steel is tariffed. The aluminum is tariffed. The semiconductors are tariffed. The wiring harness made in Mexico is tariffed. You are not buying a foreign car. You are buying a domestic car made of foreign materials, and every single one of those materials just got more expensive. Homes. The National Association of Home Builders estimated the average cost of a new home increased by $9,200 because of tariffs on lumber from Canada, appliances, and building materials. A toddler clothing set made in Cambodia that cost $24 now costs $35.76. Jeans from Egypt went from $39.98 to $43.98. A PlayStation 5 that retailed for $499 could cost over $1,000 with the full China tariff applied. Even a soccer ball, $17.99 to $23.21. 70% of the world's soccer balls are made in Pakistan. Good luck reshoring that. And here is the thing people don't realize about tariffs on consumer electronics. Your iPhone wasn't fully tariffed because smartphones got a temporary exemption in April. But your laptop accessories, your chargers, your cases, your headphones, they were all hit. Your PlayStation was hit. Your air fryer was hit. Your coffee machine was hit. The Harvard Business School Pricing Lab found especially steep price increases in clothing accessories, jewelry, household tools, toys, and personal care products. The things you buy your kids for Christmas. The things you grab at the store without thinking. Those invisible purchases that add up to hundreds of dollars a month all got quietly more expensive. And most people couldn't even tell you why. Now here's the kicker. The Harvard Business School Pricing Lab tracked actual price movements and found that imported goods rose about 4% between March and September 2025. But domestic goods also rose 2%. Why? Because when you tariff steel, the American steel company doesn't keep its old price. It raises it too. Less competition means more pricing power. The tariff didn't just tax imports, it gave domestic producers permission to charge more, and they did. The Yale Budget Lab estimated the total cost to the average American household at $2,400 per year. The Tax Policy Center put it at $2,100. The Penn-Wharton budget model calculated a lifetime loss of $22,000 for a middle-income family. $22,000. That is a used car. That is a year of community college. That is gone. This is nail number 3, the invisible inflation machine. If tariffs are a tax, then inflation is the tax collector nobody sees, and the Federal Reserve was watching this train wreck in real time. Fed Chair Jerome Powell told Congress that tariffs were responsible for the entirety of inflation's rise above the central bank's 2% target. Let me say that again. The entire overshoot in inflation in 2025 was attributable to tariffs. Goldman Sachs estimated that tariffs added 0.5 percentage point to inflation in 2025, and they projected another 0.3 point in just the first 6 months of 2026. That might sound small, it is not. Here is what happens when inflation stays elevated because of tariffs. The Fed can't cut interest rates. When the Fed can't cut rates, your mortgage stays expensive. Your car loan stays expensive. Your credit card stays expensive. Your student loan stays expensive. So not only are you paying more at the register, you are paying more to borrow money to pay for the things at the register. It is a tax on a tax. And the cruelest part, the Tax Policy Center found that the tariffs hit the poorest Americans the hardest. The bottom 20% of households saw their federal tax rate rise by 1.9 percentage points. The top 20%, only 1.4. The tariff is a regressive tax wearing a populist costume. It was sold as a way to stick it to Wall Street and bring back Main Street. In practice, it taxes the poor at a higher rate than the rich. A billionaire who spends 2% of income on imported goods barely notices. A single mother spending 60% of her income on food, clothing, and household basics feels every single penny. This is the bitter irony at the heart of the tariff experiment. The voters who cheered the loudest are the ones paying the most. And that brings us to nail number 4. The Great American Farm Betrayal. If you want to understand the true cost of this tariff experiment, drive through Iowa, drive through Kansas, drive through Indiana, talk to the soybean farmers, because they will tell you a story that should make your blood boil. In 2024, the United States exported $176 billion in agricultural products. Nearly half of that went to 3 countries: Mexico, Canada, and China. The 3 countries Trump hit with the biggest tariffs: Mexico at 25%, Canada at 25%, China at up to 145%. What happened next was as predictable as gravity. China retaliated. They slapped tariffs of up to 125% on American goods. And the first thing they stopped buying was soybeans. American soybeans, the United States' single largest agricultural export, worth over $24 billion in 2024. China, which had been importing 26 million metric tons of American soybeans annually on average since 2010, simply stopped. For months in 2025, during the fall harvest season, the biggest bumper crop in years, China bought exactly 0 American soybeans. 0. They turned to Brazil instead. Think about the cruelty of that timing. You are a soybean farmer in Minnesota. You planted in the spring, hoping the trade war would resolve. You tended your fields all summer. You harvested the biggest crop of your life in September. And then your biggest customer, the one who buys half your product, says no thanks. We're buying from South America now. And by the way, the United States just gave Argentina a $20 billion bailout. Argentina, the country that swooped in to sell your soybeans to your customer while you sat on a mountain of grain you couldn't sell. Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa posted on social media, quote, "Farmers very upset about Argentina selling soybeans to China right after USA bailout." End quote. Still 0 USA soybeans sold to China. And this wasn't even the first time during Trump's first-term trade war. China slapped retaliatory tariffs on soybeans, and the U.S. lost $27 billion in agricultural exports over 18 months. The government spent $23 billion bailing out farmers then, too. And when the dust settled, China had permanently diversified its supply chain. Brazil's share of China's soybean imports surged. As one representative from the Wisconsin Soybean Association put it, "We never regained that lost ground." China went shopping for a new supplier. We became a little less reliable to them. Now it is happening again, only worse. And it is not just soybeans. The EU threatened retaliatory tariffs targeting beef, poultry, and soybean exports, deliberately aimed at red states. Canada levied 25% duties on $30 billion worth of American goods, including peanut butter, orange juice, and coffee. They threatened to expand to $155 billion in goods if U.S. policy didn't change. China put tariffs on US-grown chicken, wheat, corn, cotton, sorghum, pork, and beef. The very voters who elected Trump to fight for them were the ones catching the retaliatory fire. The irony would be funny if it weren't destroying livelihoods. In December 2025, Trump announced a $12 billion bailout for farmers. $11 billion for row crop producers, $1 billion for specialty crops, paid from tariff revenue. So let me make sure the math is clear. The government taxes imports. The taxes provoke retaliation. The retaliation destroys farm exports. The farmers go broke. The government uses the import tax money to bail out the farmers it just destroyed. That is a Rube Goldberg machine of economic self-harm. And the farmers themselves said it plainly. As one Iowa corn and soybean farmer put it, most farmers would tell you that they don't want to go to the mailbox and get a check from the government. That is not why we farm. We need more demand for our product. This is nail number 5, the manufacturing mirage. This was supposed to be the payoff. This was the whole point. Trump promised that tariffs would bring factories roaring back to America. That was the deal. You pay a little more at the store, but your neighbor gets a factory job. The trade-off. The social contract of protectionism. Except the factories didn't roar back. They whispered, goodbye. In the 8 months following Liberation Day, the manufacturing sector lost 72,000 jobs. Every single month after April 2025 saw manufacturing payrolls shrink. The Bureau of Labor Statistics confirmed it. December 2025 alone shed 8,000 manufacturing jobs. The total job losses in tariff-impacted sectors, including manufacturing, mining, logging, wholesale trade, transportation, and warehousing, reached over 90,000. Total job growth for all of 2025 was 584,000. Sounds okay until you realize that 2023 and 2024 each added 2 million jobs. The economy didn't just slow down, it hit a wall. J.B. Brown, the CEO of a family-owned metal foundry in Indiana, told Reuters, quote, "Every time I hear that manufacturing is booming, I scream at the television," end quote. His workforce had virtually halved over the previous 2 years, and the data backed him up. Manufacturing job openings fell by 76,000. New hires declined by 18,000. Construction spending in manufacturing contracted in the first 9 months of Trump's second term, after surging under Biden-era investments in semiconductors and renewable energy. The tariffs didn't bring manufacturing home. They made manufacturing more expensive at home. Here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Modern manufacturing doesn't work the way it did in 1955. You can't just slap a tariff on Chinese goods and expect a factory to pop up in Youngstown. Modern supply chains are global, integrated, and built over decades. A single car has parts from 15 countries. A smartphone has components from 30. You can't unwind that with a tariff schedule and a rally speech. As one Harvard economist put it, we've tried industrial policy, we've tried trade protection, even before Trump's initiatives, and we haven't seen much recovery at all. If anything, it continues to decline. The uncomfortable truth is that even if manufacturing output increases, it happens with fewer workers. Automation has transformed the industry. Factories today produce more value with fewer hands. So even in the best-case scenario, even if every tariff worked exactly as planned, the jobs bonanza was never coming. The math doesn't support it. And the math, as we've seen, is the only thing that doesn't lie. Imagine you are a factory owner in Ohio. You make car parts. You need steel. Before the tariffs, you could buy steel from Korea at the global market price. Now there is a 50% tariff on that steel, so you buy American steel instead. But the American Steel Company, knowing you have no choice, raised its price to just below the tariff-adjusted import price. Your costs went up either way. Your competitor in Germany doesn't have this problem. Your competitor in Japan doesn't have this problem. You are now less competitive globally because your own government made your inputs more expensive. That is not protectionism. That is a handicap. And that brings us to nail number 6, the small business squeeze. If you are a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, tariffs are a headache. You have lawyers, lobbyists, and supply chain consultants to help you navigate the chaos. If you are a small business owner, tariffs are an existential threat. The typical small business that imports products faced more than $90,000 in tariff costs just from April to July 2025. 4 months, $90,000. These aren't companies with offshore tax havens and armies of accountants. These are family-owned shops, local manufacturers, independent retailers. They reported revenue losses of about 13%, which annualized comes to roughly $100,000 in lost sales. Corporate bankruptcies in the United States rose to the highest level since 2010. Not just the big ones you see on the news, the invisible ones, the hardware store that couldn't absorb a 25% tariff on its imported tools, the auto repair shop that saw parts costs spike, the restaurant that watched food prices climb while customers cut back on dining out. Consumer spending growth fell from 2.8% in 2024 to 1.4% in the second quarter of 2025. It fell in half. People weren't just paying more. They were buying less. And when people buy less, business is close. And when business is close, and when people lose jobs, they buy even less. It is a doom loop, and the tariff started the spin. But if you think the costs are just about money, wait until you hear what happened to the legal system. Because the tariffs didn't just break supply chains, they broke a fundamental principle of American governance. This is nail number 7. The constitutional crisis nobody's talking about. Here is a question that should concern every American regardless of their politics. Who has the power to tax? The Constitution says Congress does. Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Not the President Congress, but Trump didn't go through Congress. He used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a 1977 law designed to let the president freeze assets and block transactions during genuine national emergencies. Think nuclear threats. Think terrorism. Think wartime. Trump declared that the trade deficit was a national emergency. The trade deficit, a number that has existed for decades, that fluctuates with economic cycles, that most economists view as a natural feature of the world's reserve currency. He declared it an emergency and used that declaration to bypass Congress entirely and impose tariffs unilaterally on nearly every country on Earth. Multiple federal courts ruled he exceeded his authority. The Court of International Trade struck down 5 executive orders. The Federal Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that ruling en banc. And yet the tariffs remained in place while the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. Oral arguments were heard in November 2025. A decision is expected any day now. If the Supreme Court rules against the administration, the government would need to rebate roughly $130 billion in tariff duties already collected. $130 billion, that is money already spent, already baked into the budget. The administration has signaled it would simply reimpose the tariffs under different legal authority like Section 122 or Section 301, but the constitutional question remains. Can one person, without a vote, without a debate, impose the largest tax increase in 3 decades on every household in America? And if the answer is yes, what exactly is the limiting principle? This is nail number 8. The chaos tax. There is a cost that doesn't show up in any official statistic but might be the most damaging of all. Uncertainty, the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, which measures how unpredictable government economic policy is, doubled from January to March 2025. It reached its highest point since the onset of the COVID pandemic. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimated that this uncertainty alone reduced business investment by 4.4% in 2025. Think about what that means. A company is sitting on capital. It wants to build a new factory, hire new workers, expand into a new market, but it doesn't know if the tariff rate on its key input will be 10% next month or 50%. It doesn't know if the country it sources from will be exempted or escalated. It doesn't know if the tariffs are even legal. So what does it do? Nothing. It waits. It hoards cash. It freezes hiring. It delays investment. Trump changed tariff rates, paused them, unpaused them, exempted products, removed exemptions, added new tariffs, doubled existing tariffs, and then cut deals that partially reverse them. The timeline of tariff announcements reads like a fever dream. February tariffs on Canada and Mexico. March pause on some, escalation on China. April Liberation Day, then partial pause after market crash. May China truce. June steel and aluminum doubled to 50%. Expanded to appliances. August reciprocal tariffs finally take effect. November agricultural exemptions. China trade deal. No CEO, no small business owner, no farmer, no consumer could plan around this. The policy changed faster than a company could adjust its supply chain. One CEO of a retail company told reporters that every Monday morning they had a meeting to figure out which tariffs had changed over the weekend. Their supply chain team became a full-time tariff monitoring unit, and that is a Fortune 500 company with resources. Imagine being a 10-person import business in New Jersey trying to keep up with this. You'd need a PhD in trade law and a crystal ball, and the consultants who specialize in tariff navigation, their businesses boomed. An entire cottage industry emerged not to create value but to help companies navigate government-created complexity. That is not economic growth. That is friction tax. And that chaos has a dollar value. Goldman Sachs estimated the tariff incidence was paid 37% by consumers, 51% by businesses, and only 9% by foreign exporters. But JP Morgan warned that in 2026, businesses would start shifting their share onto consumers, potentially flipping that 80-20 split so that consumers pick up 80% of the tab. Many retailers absorbed tariff costs in 2025, drawing down inventories they'd stocked up during pause periods. That buffer is running out. The bill is coming due. Speaking of sending bills to the wrong address, let's talk about the promise that started it all. The one that said other countries would pay, because the data is in and it is not even close. This is nail number 9, the big lie. Foreign countries are paying the tariffs. That is what the president said. Over and over. It became a mantra, a bumper sticker, a shield against any criticism, and it is, to use a technical economic term, completely wrong. Here is how it actually works. An American company, say Walmart, orders a shipment of clothing from Bangladesh. The shipment arrives at the port of Long Beach. U.S. Customs and Border Protection assesses a tariff. Walmart pays the tariff, not Bangladesh, not the Bangladeshi factory, Walmart. And then Walmart decides whether to eat that cost or add it to the price of the shirt you buy. This isn't disputed. It is not debatable. It is not a liberal talking point or a conservative one. It is literally how the system operates. The U.S. International Trade Commission, a bipartisan agency, explains it on page 1 of their tariff manual. Tariffs are paid by the importer of record. Period. The U.S. collected $287 billion in customs duties in 2025, a 192% increase from 2024. Americans paid every single cent of it, and the most devastating study on this came from the Tax Foundation, which is not some left-wing think tank. It is a center-right organization that historically supports tax cuts and deregulation. They found that the tariffs constitute the largest tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993, 0.55% of GDP, larger than several tax increases that were actually called tax increases and actually voted on by Congress. The tariffs will raise $2.1 trillion over 10 years on a conventional basis. After accounting for the economic damage they cause, The net is $1.6 trillion. That is a tax paid by Americans, passed without a vote, and sold as someone else's problem. And that brings us to nail number 10. The ghost of Smoot-Hawley. In the spring of 1930, over 1,000 American economists wrote a letter to President Herbert Hoover begging him to veto a tariff bill, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. They warned it would hurt exporters, provoke retaliation, and deepen the depression. Hoover signed it anyway. Henry Ford went to the White House and called it, quote, an economic stupidity. The tariffs raised the average rate from about 13.5% to roughly 20%. Within 3 years, U.S. imports fell by 2/3, exports collapsed. Trading partners retaliated. The U.S. Senate's own website now calls Smoot-Hawley, quote, among the most catastrophic acts in congressional history. The Trump tariffs at their peak in April 2025 pushed the average effective tariff rate to 27%, higher than Smoot-Hawley. Let me say that again. The April 2025 tariff rate was higher than the one that helped deepen the Great Depression. Even after the pauses and the deals and the exemptions, the rate settled at 16.8% by November 2025. The highest since 1935. Jeremy Siegel, professor emeritus of the Wharton School of Business, called the Trump tariffs, quote, the biggest policy mistake in 95 years, end quote. 95 years takes you right back to Smoot-Hawley. And what happened after Smoot-Hawley? The Republicans lost the House, the Senate, and the presidency. They didn't fully recover for decades. As Senator Rand Paul noted, when McKinley put tariffs on in 1890, the party lost 50% of their seats. When Smoot-Hawley passed, they lost Congress for 60 years. Tariffs aren't just bad economics. Historically, they're bad politics too. The bill always comes due, and the voter always remembers who sent it. Now, there is one important difference. Smoot-Hawley was debated by Congress. It was voted on. It went through the democratic process. It was terrible policy, but it was constitutional policy. Trump's tariffs were imposed by executive decree under emergency powers. One man's signature. No vote. No debate. No congressional approval. Ronald Reagan, in 1986, said, quote, the Smoot-Hawley tariff ignited an international trade war and helped sink our country into the Great Depression. The same party, the same economic warning. 95 years later, ignored. And that brings us to the part that matters most. Not the numbers, not the statistics, not the courtroom drama. The people. This is nail number 11. The human toll nobody's counting. 2/3 of Americans expressed concern about the impact of tariffs on their finances in December 2025. Almost 70% predicted 2026 would be a year of economic difficulty. More than half blamed the administration, but polls are abstractions. Let me make it real. Charlie Radman is a fourth-generation farmer near Randolph, Minnesota. His family has worked that land since 1899, over 120 years of planting and harvesting. He told reporters that the $12 billion bailout was, quote, a bridge, not the ultimate solution. What we really want is a little more certainty and not have to rely on these ad hoc payments, end quote. Gene Stelly farms corn, soybeans, and wheat. When Trump ran for president, Stelly worried that trade disputes would jeopardize his international sales. A year later, he said his fears had become reality. His customers went shopping elsewhere, and they might not come back. A 55-year-old couple earning $90,000 a year saw their health insurance premium jump from $638 a month to $2,179 a month. Part of that was the expiration of subsidies. Part of that was insurance companies factoring tariff costs into their projections. Some insurers explicitly stated in their rate filings that they were adding 2 to 3% to premiums to account for tariff-related uncertainty. The result is the same. More money out. Less life in. 1.4 million fewer Americans selected marketplace health plans in 2026. Not because they didn't need insurance, because they couldn't afford it. Think about what that means. Over 1 million people looked at the price of staying healthy and decided they couldn't swing it. In the richest country on earth, and it is not just insurance, millions of residents across 49 states and Washington, D.C. will face higher utility bills or proposals for increased rates by 2027. costing consumers nearly $85.8 billion by 2028. The Home Builder Sentiment Index fell to its lowest level in more than 2 years as mortgage rates stayed elevated and tariff-driven material costs pushed home prices further out of reach. The American dream of owning a home didn't die. It just got a $9,200 tariff surcharge. Farm bankruptcies rose to the highest level since 2021. Corporate bankruptcies hit the highest level since 2010. Manufacturing employment slipped below pre-pandemic levels. And when the Bureau of Labor Statistics released data in August showing a sharp slowdown in hiring, with revised numbers revealing that job growth had been far weaker than initially reported, the president's response was not to adjust policy. It was to dismiss the data as, quote, rigged and fire the BLS commissioner. Let that sink in. The government's own statistical agency produced numbers that contradicted the narrative, and the response was to shoot the messenger. When the thermometer tells you the patient has a fever, you don't fire the thermometer. You treat the patient. But treating the patient would mean admitting the tariffs aren't working, and that was never going to happen. And the accounting trick at the heart of the whole experiment deserves its own spotlight. This is nail number 12, the fiscal illusion. Speaking of uncomfortable truths, let's not pretend the tariff story is only about costs. The administration collected $287 billion in tariff revenue in 2025. That is real money, and some of it funded the big, beautiful bill, the administration's sweeping tax and spending legislation. But here's the accounting trick. The tariff revenue is supposed to pay for the tax cuts, except the tax cuts cost more than the tariffs raise. The Committee for a Responsible Budget projected that the total package adds trillions to the deficit. So the tariffs don't replace income taxes as Trump suggested, they supplement them. You are not trading one tax for another, you are paying both. And the tariff revenue itself is a mirage. The Tax Foundation estimated that on a dynamic basis after accounting for economic damage, the revenue drops from $2.1 trillion to $1.6 trillion over 10 years. And that doesn't account for the bailout payments. $12 billion for farmers in December 2025. $23 billion for farmers in the first term's trade war. Whatever comes next. You are taxing the economy, damaging the economy, and then spending the tax revenue to repair the damage. It is like setting your house on fire and then bragging about how much you spent on the fire department. So here we are. The verdict, let's be clear about what this experiment actually produced. It wasn't just a policy, it was a stress test on the American economy, the largest economy on the planet, conducted live in real time with no control group and no exit plan. And the results are in. The promise was that other countries would pay. They didn't. Americans paid $287 billion in tariff revenue in 2025 alone, a 192% increase. The promise was that factories would come roaring back. They didn't. Manufacturing lost 72,000 jobs in 8 months. The promise was that the trade deficit would shrink. It didn't meaningfully change because trade deficits are driven by macroeconomic forces, not tariff schedules. The promise was that prices wouldn't go up. They did. The average household is paying between $1,300 and $2,400 more per year. The promise was that tariffs would be a negotiating tool, used briefly and then lifted. A year later, the average effective tariff rate sits at around 17%, the highest since the 1930s. Here's the final bill of the tariff experiment. $2.1 trillion in projected tariff revenue over 10 years, paid entirely by American businesses and consumers. 272,000 manufacturing jobs lost since Liberation Day. $3.5 trillion in stock market value erased in 2 days. $412 billion in emergency farm bailouts on top of $23 billion from the first term. 5 average household cost of $1,300 to $2,400 per year, hitting the poorest Americans hardest. 6. The highest tariff rate in nearly a century. 7. A constitutional crisis over whether one person can tax an entire nation without a vote. There will be defenses, there always are. Supporters will point to the deals struck with Japan, South Korea, the UK. They'll point to the China truce. They'll point to the fact that a recession was avoided, that GDP still grew, that the stock market eventually recovered to new highs. And they won't be entirely wrong about any of that. But the question was never whether the economy could survive a tariff shock. America is the largest economy on Earth. Of course, it can absorb a hit. The question is whether the hit was worth it, whether the factories came, whether the workers benefited, whether the cure was better than the disease. And the data says no, the factories didn't come. The workers got squeezed. The farmers got hung out to dry and then handed a check to stop them from complaining. The consumers paid more for everything from toddler clothes to pickup trucks, and the one group that was supposed to pay, the foreign countries, paid 9 cents on every tariff dollar, while Americans paid the other 91. This is the cruel math of the tariff experiment. It promised to punish others and rewarded the very countries it targeted. China diversified away from American soybeans and bought from Brazil. Vietnam rerouted supply chains through third countries. The EU accelerated trade deals with Asia and South America. The countries that were supposed to be hurt found workarounds. The country that imposed the tariffs absorbed the damage, and through it all, the American consumer, the person who was told they wouldn't pay a dime, picked up the tab. Every time they bought a car, every time they fixed a roof, every time they bought their kid a winter coat. The tariff experiment isn't over. The Supreme Court ruling could rewrite the rules. New tariffs on pharmaceuticals and semiconductors are under consideration. The China truce expires in November 2026, and there is a midterm election coming that will, in many ways, serve as a referendum on this very question. Is the price worth it? But whatever happens next, the forensic record is already written. $2.1 trillion. Not in someone else's pocket, in yours. Taken not by a vote, not by a law, not by a debate on the floor of the House of Representatives. Taken by a signature on a piece of paper that declared your grocery bill a national emergency. And here is what the record will show. The tariff experiment was the largest peacetime transfer of wealth from consumers to the federal government in modern American history. It was enacted without congressional approval. It was defended with a claim that was economically false. It produced the opposite of its stated goal. And the people who paid the highest price, the farmers, the small business owners, the low-income families stretching every dollar, were the same people who were told they'd benefit the most. You cannot tariff your way to prosperity any more than you can borrow your way out of debt. 1,000 economists said so in 1930. The data says so now. The only question is how long before the textbooks catch up to the receipts. If you found this forensic deep dive valuable, hit that subscribe button. It helps the algorithm understand that people actually want to see the math behind the headlines, not the spin. And stick around, because the story of what happens when the Supreme Court rules, when the China truce expires in November, and how the 2026 midterms reshape American trade policy, is going to be the most consequential economic chapter of this decade. The receipts are piling up, and somebody's going to have to pay. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, economics isn't just about money. It is about every choice you can't afford to make anymore.